Now we're going to go through and do some practice problems using our distance and our midpoint formula. We have those right here on this page, so you want to keep this handy so we can reference these formulas as we go through and do these practice problems on the next page. So let's start with number 1A. And we need to do the midpoint and the distance formula for each one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label my x1 and my y1 and my x2 and my y2. I think that makes it a lot easier, especially until you're really sure you know what you're doing with your formulas. So we'll do the midpoint on the left and the distance formula on the right. And if you remember our midpoint formula, it's right here. X1 plus x2 divided by 2. That gives us the x coordinate of our midpoint. And then we've got y1 plus y2 divided by 2. That gives us the y coordinate of our midpoint. So the midpoint, we're basically just going to be adding our x's together. So I've got 1 plus 3 over 2. And then I've got 2 plus 7 over 2. 1 plus 3, that gives me 4. So now I have 4 over 2. 2 plus 7 is 9 over 2. And then I'm going to divide by 2. So my midpoint is going to be at 2, 4.5. Now I'll tell you some of the common mistakes that I see students making. They either don't divide by 2, so they might leave the answer as 4, 9, or they divide by 2 twice. I'm not really sure why they're doing that, but they get a little confused and they will end up dividing by 2 twice, which would give us 2 and then 2.25 here. I'm sorry, 1 and 2.25, which is incorrect. So just make sure you're paying attention. Now we're going to do our distance formula. And we're going to do x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And all of that is underneath our square root symbol. So we're going to do this out the long way, and then I'll probably do that on 2, and then the other 2 I'm going to show you how we can just stick it in our calculator once we get it to this point. Our midpoint formula, there's not a way to put this in the calculator once I have this, because there's a comma. I have 2 different parts, so I'll show you that in just a minute. So here we go. The distance equals the square root. Well, 3 minus 1, that would be 2 squared. Plus 7 minus 2, that gives me 5 squared. So 2 squared is going to be 4, and 5 squared is 25. And so I get the square root of 29, which is not going to be an exact number. So I'm going to get approximately, an approximation. And so that is going to be 5.4. Okay. Now let's do our midpoint. Well, first let's label. So x1, y1, x2, y2, and our midpoint formula. So -6 plus 2 divided by 2, and then I've got 4. Well, when I add a negative, I'm just going to subtract that over 2. Now, when we get to this point, a lot of students want to stick that in the calculator, and they say, well, where's the comma? I have this comma right here. Why can't I use that? Well, it just doesn't work. That comma is not what we would use here. So we can do this a couple of different ways. I will tell you, a lot of students also will do -6 plus 2 divided by 2, and they'll get -5. Well, that's not the right answer right here. We need to be very careful because our calculator takes into account order of operations. So it divides this first instead of adding first. So if we put parentheses around that, then we get -2 as our answer, which is correct. So m equals -2. And then I can do the same thing. 4 minus 8. Just be sure you put your parentheses around everything that's on top. Oh, whoops. Over 2. And I get negative 2 for that one also. So the midpoint between these 2 points is negative 2, negative 2. Now let's set up our distance formula. So D equals the square root of x2 minus x1. Well, when I minus a negative, I end up adding it. So plus 6 squared plus y2, which is negative 8, minus y1. Now, let me show you how we can put this in the calculator. And my calculator is not quite as nice as the calculators you have at school, since mine's a little bit older. So we would do the square root. Now at school, it'll actually carry this all the way down, and you can stay under that little bar. On mine, it opens a parentheses. So if you're using an older calculator, make sure you're paying attention to your parentheses. So I'm going to open parentheses again, and 2 plus 6 squared plus negative 8 minus 4 squared. And then I've got to close parentheses. That's saying that everything is underneath that square root sign. And I get 14.4. So the distance between those 2 points is 14.4. And that's an approximation, right? So here, let's work these out by hand. So we've got x1, y1, x2, y2, my midpoint. So I'm going to have negative 5 minus 6 over 2, and 2 plus 10 over 2. Negative 5 minus 6 is going to give me a negative 11 over 2. 2 plus 10 is 12 over 2. So the midpoint is going to be negative 5.56. Now let's do our distance formula. So D equals the square root of x2, negative 6, minus x1. So I'm going to add that 5, plus y2 minus y1. And let's work this out by hand. So negative 6 plus 5 gives me negative 1. And then 10 minus 2 gives me 8. Now, negative 1 squared, that's just going to be 1. 8 squared is 64. So the distance is the square root of 65. Well, I don't know what that is. So let's stick that in our calculator here. It's going to give me 8.1. So the distance is approximately 8.1. Now let's do this last problem here with our calculator method. So let's set it all up, of course. The midpoint equals negative 1 minus 5 over 2, negative 3 minus 2 over 2. So we've got lots of negatives going on here. So remember, we've got to put the stuff on the top in parentheses. So negative 1 minus 5 divided by 2. I get negative 3. And then I have negative 3 minus 2 over 2. And I get negative 2.5. Now the distance formula, D equals the square root of negative 5 plus 1 squared plus negative 2 plus 3 squared. So now if I'm totally sure that I got this part right, I can just put it straight in my calculator. So the square root of negative 5 plus 1 squared plus negative 2 plus 3 squared. Close my parentheses. Uh-oh. See, I must have made an error. So let's look. Oh, you see how I did not open my parentheses right there. Okay, so let me show you a little trick. If you hit second enter, it brings up that last equation. and I can do second delete, and then I can insert my parentheses. So now hopefully that works. So the distance is approximately 4.1. And that's units.